Today we're going to be talking about Plato's metaphysics, and in particular, the theory of forms, which is a major innovation. Now, it's a little strange that we've started with Aristotle, and then we're stepping back to Plato, because historically they went in the opposite direction here. On the other hand, Aristotle's view is much more our sort of common sense view, you might say, that what the world consists of are objects, substances, and they have properties, they stand in relations, they exist at times and places, they do things, they have things done to them, and so on. And Plato's view is somewhat different. He argues for certain things that are known as forms within his theory, or, more broadly speaking, universals. And those are a little bit less commonsensical. So we're going to start with the distinction between particular objects, objects that can't have multiple instances. There's only one of them. Particular things like people, for example, me, or Gavrilo Princip. You can see I was teaching World War I in another course when I first made up these slides. Or buildings like the Empire State Building, Perry Castaneda Library, that beach ball, this grain of sand. All of those are particular things. Austin is a particular city. Texas, a particular state. Sarajevo, a particular city. November 11th, 1980, a particular date, a particular time, or the assassination of the Archduke, something that is a particular event. All of those are things that exist once. They might continue for a long time, but they don't have multiple instances. It's not like, hey, I saw a Dan Bonavac today, but of course there are a lot of them around. No, there's just one. And the same thing with the Empire State Building. Even if we built a bunch of replicas of it, they would be replicas of this one thing, the Empire State Building. We wouldn't end up saying, oh, just now, now there are lots of Empire State Buildings. And suddenly, November 11th, 1918, that happened once. It's not like, oh, gee, I wish it were November 11th, 1918 again this year. It can't be. It happens once. The contrast is with universals. Universals are things that can have multiple instances. There can be lots of them. So, for example, properties can be like this. Red. There can be lots of things that are red. In fact, as I look around the room, I see a bunch of different things that are red. Triangular. Lots of things can be triangular. The same thing with large. Lots of things can be large. Relations are like this too. Between. Lots of things can be between two other things. And so between is the sort of relation that can keep recurring. The same thing with on. The camera is on the tripod is on the table, and so on. We've got multiple instances all over the place. Love. There can be lots of instances of love. One person loving another, somebody loving an animal, the animal loving the back, etc. The same thing with friendship. Those are things that can be instantiated all over the place. They can have multiple instances. Kinds are like this. Kinds like tiger, which is a natural kind, or building, pencil, shortstop. Those are things that are more socially constructed. But in any event, those are things that can have multiple instances. There can be lots of tigers, lots of buildings, lots of pencils, lots of shortstops. Books are like this too. The Bible, you might say, is one book, or one of my favorite novels, Edwin Mulhouse. But those are things that can have multiple instances. You can have many copies of the Bible. You can have translations of the same book into different languages and so on. And similarly, there could be many different copies of Edwin Mulhouse, some hardback, some softcover, some Kindle versions, and so on. And musical works are like this too. Luckenbach's Texas, that's a song that could exist in many different copies. You could have a vinyl record of it, you could have an MP3 file, you could have a CD with that on it. There could be lots and lots of different copies. You might have sheet music and so on. And similarly for Bach's Toccata in Fugue in D minor. That's something you might find all over the place in lots of different forms. You might find it, notice, not only in physical copies like CDs or sheet music, but performances of it. I could sit down and start playing you the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And that's something that would be an instance of that particular thing, that particular event, that particular performance would be an instance of that more universal thing. Now here's the question that starts dividing philosophers. Are universals real? Virtually everyone agrees that particulars are real, that yes, people, particular objects and so on are real things. Not everybody, by the way, but lots of people do. However, what about universals? A realist says yes. These things do exist. There is such a thing as triangularity, or love, or friendship. And moreover, those things are independent of the mind. They don't just exist as concepts. They really are there in some sense in the world. So there really is a property, for example, of largeness. There really is a property of being blue. And then there are really relations, like one thing being on another, or like love or friendship. The conceptualist says, well, yes, these things do exist. They are real. But on the other hand, they're dependent on the mind. They exist as concepts, as things we construct. And so we construct an idea of love. We construct an idea of friendship or triangularity or blue. And really, they are, in some sense, mind-dependent. They're real things. We can talk about them. But they're real in the sense of being mental constructions, not in the sense of, being really independent of us. And then a nominalist says, no, everything is particular. There are no such things as universals. When we talk about love or friendship in the abstract, we are really just talking about particular instances of loving or of being friends. And everything we say is really something that we're saying about those particular instances. There's no such thing as the abstract relation of loving or being a friend of something. And so we can have a little chart. We could say, are these things real or not? And if they're real, then are they mind-dependent or mind-independent? And hence the little chart at the bottom. The conceptualist says real, but mind-dependent. The realist, or often just called Platonist, after Plato, the most famous one, says they are real and they're mind-independent. They are really, in some sense, out there independently of us. And the nominalist says they're unreal. And I put that under the mind-dependent thing because the nominalist says really all we have is language. We refer to certain relationships as love relationships, for example, but it's really a question of how we use the term. And so there is no such thing as love in the abstract, but on the other hand, we use the term in a certain way, and the way in which we use it is dependent on the mind. So that's why I put it over there. Now, why on earth would we think that these universals, these forms, as Plato calls them, are real things? Why would we not adopt the nominalist attitude? Plato gives a number of arguments, and we'll look at some of them in more detail, but the general idea is this. They're necessary for knowledge. Without forms, we couldn't understand why things happen. We could maybe look at particular things, but we could never rise to the level of generalities or universal laws about them. So, for example, I am going to let go of this pen. What do you think is going to happen? It's going to fall, right? There it goes. Now I'm going to let go, oh, this is going to be messy. I'm going to let go of this eraser. What do you think is going to happen to it? It's going to fall. Ooh, yes, it did. Now, what do you think if I were to, what else do we have? Ooh, we have these papers. Oh, I can make a horrible mess up here. I have this pile of pink papers. What do you think will happen if I let go of it? It'll fall. Yeah, well, I didn't make a mess. Now notice what's going on here. All sorts of particular events, and they all fit a certain pattern, right? Of me letting go of things and they fall. Well, here's Plato's argument. If we didn't have universals, if we couldn't talk about gravity, for example, as a universal force, we'd just say, gosh, you know what? That thing fell. Then that thing fell when you let go. And that thing fell. You know, I guess lots of things fall when you let them go. But there'd be no way to actually formulate a law of gravitation and talk about gravitation as a general thing. And so Plato says, look, we'd be at the level of just saying, yeah, lots of crap happens. There are lots of particular things. Let me tell you stories. And in a way, history is often like that. We just have to tell you some stories. It's hard to formulate universal laws about history, though people have tried. But with lots of other things, we do formulate those laws. And so we have to think about gravitation in general. We have to think about forces in general. We have to think about things that have a universal applicability and have a kind of necessity to them, too. The sense isn't just, you know, how quirky, it just happened to fall. No, we have the sense it had to fall. Given that I let it go, it didn't have a choice. It wasn't like, oh, what a weird lucky thing that it fell again. We get the sense, no, it has to fall. It's a law-like thing. And how could we account for anything that was really universal, anything that was really law-like, if we didn't have these universal things at stake? So, basically, Plato says, we'd just be stuck at the level of saying, yeah, lots of times you let them go, they fall. What a thing. And we wouldn't be able to formulate anything that was universal, anything that was necessary, anything that was law-like. But there's another argument he gives, which is, look, there must be something that all things we call love or friendship or instances of gravitation, or for that matter, blue, or triangles, or whatever it is, tigers, they must have something in common. There must be something by virtue of which we call those animals tigers, that color blue, those shapes triangles, and so on. And so he says, whenever we have a term F, like tiger, or blue, or triangle, or triangular, or love, or friendship, or whatever it is, it must be that all the things that instantiate that have something in common, something by virtue of which we call them that thing. So, let's take a look at an instance of finding something in common like that. I admit this is a little bit silly. It's a slight stretch, but still.
Oh, good, somebody shadow. I'll just turn and write down my work. Nice. Oh, you torpedo can't tell property. That's it. Look. I can't believe you vandalized your own hometown bar. What would Gemini Springfield say? What did you go with it? Oh, will you please tell me make a big deal of this?
What for? Nobody cared when Bogart debates that sidewalk in Hollywood.
Well, I'm just shocked by this whole family. Whatever happened to the old-fashioned town fire? It's been going down since the lake caught fire. Now, just a darn minute. This town is a part of who you are. This is a Springfield isotope town. When you wear it, you're wearing Springfield. When you eat a fish from a river, you're eating Springfield. When you make lemonade from our trees, you're drinking Springfield. When you give that lecture, you're boring Springfield. Yeah, who's in the town and I'll show respect for it. This town is a part of us all. A part of us all. A part of us all. Sorry to repeat myself, but it'll help you remember. This town is a part of us all. A part of us all. A part of us all. Well, that does work.
Okay, so there's something that everything connected to Springfield has in common. There's something it has in common. There's something it has in common. Okay? And the idea is, yeah, look, it's like, it's not just happenstance we call all of these particular animals cats. There must be something these things have in common by virtue of which we call them cats. It's not just arbitrary. I mean, suppose I introduce a weird term like blef, and you say, well, what's blef mean? And I said, well, it either refers to the main building or hats that people wear in class. You'd think that's not a thing, right? Because you don't see what those things have in common. And that's something that you might say isn't true of the terms we really use in language. They aren't weird artificial things like that. We really talk about things that refer to something. We talk about gravity. We talk about love, friendship, triangularity. As abstract things, we also use terms like tiger or blue or triangular, and we do it in systematic ways because those things have something in common. Now, let's talk about something that Aristotle notes as fundamental to substances. He says substances admit contrary qualities. Another way of putting that is that substances can change. They can have one quality at one time and another quality at another time. Here I am right now speaking, and here I am remaining silent. How is that possible? Now you might think, well, it's very easy. Close your mouth. You don't say anything. But I think I'm the same person once I've done it, right? And yet you can look at this and start thinking it's puzzling. Is Bottovac speaking? True. Is Bottovac silent? True. Well, gosh, it looks like I can be speaking at one moment, silent the next moment. How is that possible? Now, again, it doesn't seem that hard, except when you look at the history of Greek philosophy. You realize, actually, this was a sort of problem that people took very seriously. It took them a long time to come up with some analysis of this. So, for example, here's Parmenides. He looks at the candles burning, for example, and notices that, on the left, the wax is solid. We've just lit the candles. But by the time they've been burning for quite a while, the wax has melted, and they're no longer solid. So we've got a good example of this kind of change. The candle, or the wax, starts out solid, and then by the end, it is not solid. So, is it the same thing that we have, or are they two different things? Parmenides looks and says, well, wait a minute. Surely nothing can have contrary qualities. Something cannot be both solid and liquid at the same time, for example. I can't be silent and speaking at the same time. And so we might think, as Parmenides says here, well, gosh, it would be a contradiction to say this thing is both F and not F for any characteristic F. We can't say this thing is both hot and cold. It is both speaking and silent. It is both solid and liquid. And he says, well, look what happens in a case of seeming change. Something goes from having a property F to not having it, from being solid to not being solid, from speaking to not speaking, etc. He says, but wait a minute, the same thing cannot be both F and not F. It can't be both solid and liquid. It can't be both speaking and not speaking. And so, he says, that means we really can't have the same thing on both sides. So either we've got to say we've got different things, or we've got to say the change is unreal. The change is fake. It didn't happen. And that's the heart of the dilemma, if you want to think of it this way, that Parmenides chooses. He says, look, nothing can have these contrary qualities. Nothing can be both speaking and silent. Nothing can be both solid and not solid. And so, he says, it looks as if the person is speaking at one moment and then silent the next. It looks as if the candle is solid and then not solid. But he says, it's unreal. It doesn't happen. So he looks at these seeming cases of change, and he denies their possibility. He says, I know it looks like things change, but they don't. Actually, the world is entirely stable, and change is a dirty trick. Well, there's something like this argument going on in Zeno. I didn't really put a slide about this, but you've perhaps heard of Zeno's paradoxes. We'll talk about them a little later. But they have to do with motion, a particular kind of change being impossible. Zeno argues, I could not possibly move over there and switch to the next slide. Why not? Well, because to get there, I'd have to go halfway. But then to get there from there, I'd have to go halfway again. And then to get there, halfway again. And that would be an infinite series of motion, so I could never get there. Now, I refute him thus. But we'll come back to that problem. Actually, it's a much trickier problem than you might think. It wasn't until the 19th century, when people developed theories of infinite sequences and limits, that they began to understand how it's possible to actually do that. It's not that anybody was really convinced by Zeno. Well, maybe a few people were. But most people thought, no, well, of course change and motion are possible. On the other hand, we do have this argument that it's impossible, and it's not a trivial argument. How do we explain how it's possible? And so it's not until people began to realize infinite sequences could have finite sums that they began to see how it could happen. Well, let's look at another reaction to this problem. Heraclitus thinks about this kind of change, for example, the wax being solid and then not solid, and says, no, it's a different sort of thing. Admittedly, nothing can have contrary qualities. Nothing can be both solid and not solid. In a case of change, it looks like the same thing is solid, then not solid. He says, but wait, the same thing can't be both solid and not solid, so here's his answer. It's not the same object. It's a different thing. Every time something changes, it is just a new object. If it were the same object, that thing would have contradictory properties. Can't happen. Can't be both solid and not solid. Can't be both speaking and silent. So every time I speak, I'm a new person. As soon as I remain silent, I'm a new person. Same thing with the wax. It is different every time. And so we get something completely different. By the way, I have the chariots up there because in Indian philosophy, that's the main instance of change that people talk about. So Heraclitus basically looks at this situation and says, it's not the same wax. Okay, that's how he solves it. It's something completely different. And his famous saying is you can't put your foot into the same river twice. The river's different, you're different. Everything changes the moment you put your foot into the river. Well, there are other people who have different reactions to this problem. The sophists, for example, are relativists. And so they end up saying, man is the measure of all things. And when they say that, we'll come back to this near the end of the course, but they really mean each person is the measure of everything. What is just what appears to you. That's the way things are for you. The way things are for me might not be the way they are for you. And so, truth is something that is relative. They also argue that meaning is relative. And so what you mean by your words may not be the same as what I mean by my words. Maybe when I call something blue, I mean totally different. Something totally different from what you mean when you call something blue. And the same thing with love. Maybe your conception of love is very different from mine. Maybe we mean totally different things when we talk about triangles and so on. And so maybe we don't mean the same thing. Maybe my own meaning changes over time. Maybe what I mean by blue or love or triangular today is different from what I meant yesterday. Maybe it's constantly changing, in fact. And so the sophist tends to think, well, you talk about wax, I talk about wax, you have in mind the solid stuff, I have in mind the not solid stuff, and yeah, that's the way it is. And so when you say something is wax, gosh, that may or may not be something that corresponds to my idea of wax. It's just sort of wax for you. And you may have a totally different idea. There's another group that we'll come back to much more the rest of this week, the skeptics, who just deny the possibility of knowledge at all. They say, look, there is such a thing as truth, so in that sense, they're not relativists. They think there is such a thing as real truth, but we can't have access to it. And they worry about the fact that there's real meaning, but we can't have access to real meanings either. And so I can't really know what you mean. In fact, maybe I can't even know what I mean, because there's no way for meaning to be something that I could get a grasp on. There are truths about what we mean, it's just that we can't have knowledge of it. Well, you might say, look, all of this is pretty strange. The skeptic essentially says, yeah, what on earth are you thinking of when you talk about wax? What's the relationship between the wax that's solid and the wax that's not solid? I don't know. Basically ask the skeptic any kind of question, they say, I don't know, could be. And so, in fact, the people who are skeptics in the ancient world say, look, that's the advantage of skepticism. You never have to take a stand, you never have to commit yourself. Somebody comes in and says, hey, wow, it's really cool today. You say, yeah, it could be. Right? That's why Diogenes Laertius refers to the skeptics as the least surly of the philosophers. Because no matter what you say, they'll say, maybe, could be, I don't know. And they never actually try to force you into anything. Of course, most of the skeptics actually try to force you out of your claims to knowledge. But nevertheless, they don't really make any claims of their own. Now, if we think about this from a common sense point of view, we can think, wait, there's something wrong here. What do you think actually happens when I am speaking one moment and silent the next? Or when the wax melts and it's solid one moment and not solid the next? Yeah?
Would that be a case of like a particular change?
Okay, good. It would be a case of a particular change. And how does the particular change? How do we explain this without getting some kind of contradiction? Yeah? Well, it could be the environment acting on it, like the heat from the flame affecting the wax, for example. Or it might be that I respond to what you said, and so it's the environment, your comment, marking the comment from me. So indeed, it could be something coming from the outside that prompts the change. Or it could be something from the inside. I might wind up a clock, for example, or wind up a little creature. Did you have these when you were a little kid, these little critters that would, you'd wind them up and they'd like go, you know, they'd crawl for about 6 inches and stop. You know, and there it's not so much an outside force as something you created internally by winding them up, and then they go. And so it could be either of those things, but the same thing, right, is changing. Now, the same thing, we want to say, has this property, and then a contrary property a little later. So how do we explain that? We can, of course, talk about the causes of it, but just how do we explain that without a contradiction? Yeah?
It's not necessary, is a necessary action to make you. Like, you speaking doesn't make you as a person.
Ooh, okay, good. So Aristotle answers this by distinguishing accidental properties from essential properties. And he says, look, some properties I can change and still be me. So, for example, I can speak, I can be silent, still me. But there may be other properties that I really cannot change without ceasing to be me. And maybe being human is one of those. If I were suddenly to turn into a cockroach, as in the Franz Kafka story, you might have reason to think that's no longer me. Like, I don't know what happened, but there we were, in the middle of the lecture, the professor turned into a cockroach. And we were all amazed and fled the classroom when somebody stepped on him. Okay? What did you step on and kill Dan Monback? Well, you might say, oh, no, I stepped on this cockroach, and I don't think that was him anymore. Okay, he was a human being. Somehow he turned into this cockroach and so on and so on. So anyway, yeah, Aristotle says, look, certain kinds of changes do produce a different thing. Heraclitus is sometimes right, but on the other hand, not all changes are like that. Most changes take place and it's still the same thing. So that would be one way of doing this. Here's another way of doing it, to say, look, it's crucial that there are different times here. And so it's not as if the thing is both solid and not solid at the same time. It's not as if I'm silent and speaking at the same time. It's instead that I'm speaking at one moment and silent at another moment. And it's the same thing with the wax. It is solid now, but not solid at this other time. And so if we think about the properties as being properties at a time, then there's no contradiction. I can be F at time t, and not f at times t prime, as long as those are different times, without encountering any contradiction. Now, well, yes, we've already talked about Aristotle, who does this in terms of essences, and say, yes, there can be different properties, but same essence. And Locke will say, yeah, look at this. The way we use terms about objects, we're really grouping together a bunch of these stages. So Heraclitus would see a bunch of different stages of the river and would call each one a different object. Locke says what we do in talking about objects is we take a bunch of those stages and we group them together. And so, for example, we look for a certain kind of continuity. If it's just like a sand pile, we're talking about continuity of substance, continuity of the stuff that's in it. If we're interested in a machine, we're talking about continuity of structure. If it's a body of some kind, like an animal, then we're interested in continuity of physical parts, continuity of bodily structure. And then if it's a human being, we're interested in continuity of consciousness. But Locke would say, yeah, in a way, Heraclitus is right, except that we take a bunch of those things and group them together, and that's what we mean by objects. Well, let's go back to thinking about the wax. And thinking, by the way, this is an example that Descartes makes famous, the problem of the wax. But now let's think about how Plato answers this. He says, I'm saying there is a universal at stake, being waxed. And I'm interested in the way in which it might be instantiated in a particular object. And I'm claiming that if we think about these universals, these forms, we can explain change. We can explain regularities, like the things falling and constantly falling, not just by happenstance, but in a law-like way. We can think general thoughts about gravitation, or love, or friendship, or triangularity, as well as about particular triangles, about particular objects. We can think the same thought at different times. I can think today, this is a triangle, and tomorrow, this is a triangle, and it's the same thought. We're thinking the same thing. It has the same content. It explains why you can think a thought or say something that has exactly the same content as what I think or say. And finally, it's going to explain how we can think veridical thoughts. That is to say, how we can represent the world accurately, how we can actually say something true. So forms are going to be his key to explaining all of this stuff. There will be something like the form of wax that is going to enable us to talk about the wax being the same wax and being wax, even though all its perceptible properties change. Its solidity changes, its temperature changes, its color may change, all sorts of things may change about it, but still we say it's wax and even the same wax. And so that's how we will solve the problems that Parmenides and Heraclitus and the Sophists and the skeptics pose. All of those things will refer to the form of wax. Now here's the way Plato begins to talk about this. He introduces something known as the divided line. He says you have to imagine that there are two ruling powers. One of them set over the intellectual world, the other over the visible world. Now take a line, cut into two unequal parts, divide each of them again in the same proportion, and suppose the two main divisions answer, one to the visible and the other to the intelligible world. Then compare the subdivisions in respect to their clearness and want of clearness, and you will find that the first section in the sphere of the visible consists of images. And by images I mean shadows, reflections in water, and all of that. So, the next section includes objects, animals we see, what Aristotle calls substances, everything that grows or is made. Now all of this is a little bit hard to follow from just the verbal description, but if you start drawing the line out as he asks, it makes more sense. This is something like, oh, and it didn't line up. Why didn't it line up? It was lined up on the screen. But now it's not. Oh, and it turned it into a PD. Well, no, it isn't. I can't explain this. It all worked perfectly yesterday. They were all aligned. Oh, this is what happens when you don't have proper access to the forms. It all goes haywire. See? Well, anyway, the left two column areas there are supposed to be the visible world, and the areas on the right are the intellectual world. So the first part there is shadows and reflections. And with respect to those, we just have perceptions, ways in which things appear to us. We see these shadows, we see these reflections, but that's all there is. The second category there is still within the visible world. It's supposed to be the objects of perception. And so there he says we can have beliefs, we can have opinions about those. We don't have true knowledge of them. However, on the right-hand side, part of the intellectual world, that third column are the mathematical forms. Things like triangularity, or numbers, fall into this category, and there we can actually attain understanding. But then finally, the last category, the most abstract forms, those are the things that are really in the sphere of reason. And so things like love and friendship will go there. Those are the most, you might say, abstract things we can talk about. Now, here's the idea. Just as shadows and reflections are shadows and reflections of the objects of perception, so mathematical forms are something like the shadows of the abstract forms. And the entire visible world is something like a shadow or a representation of this abstract world, the intelligible world, the world of the forms. So he's really saying, in a sense, the universals are the most real things. And the things around us, the particulars, those just instantiate those. Those are something like shadows thrown by these universals, these abstract forms. It's hard to represent what Plato exactly has in mind, but here is the image he actually gives. He doesn't show people the Simpson episode. Instead, he talks about the allegory of the cave, one of the most famous parts of the Republic. He says, let me show you in a figure. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, which has a mouth open toward the light, reaching all along the den. Here they've been from their childhood. They have their legs and necks chained so they can't move and only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning around their heads. Above and behind them is a fire, blazing at a distance. Between the fire and the prisoners, there's a raised way, and you'll see if you look over a low wall built along there, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. And he says, you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels, statues, figures of animals made of wood and stone, and so on, and they appear over the wall. Some are talking, others are silent. You've shown me a strange image. They're strange prisoners. Well, like ourselves, they see only their shadows or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? And the objects which are being carried in like manner, they'd see only the shadows. Yes, he said. Well, this is really supposed to be our situation. If we were able to converse, or if they were able to converse with one another, wouldn't they suppose they were naming what was actually before them? Oh yes, very true. Suppose that the prison had an echo coming from the other side. They would think the shadows were speaking. Yes. Then the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images. And that is exactly our situation. Now in this classroom, it's really easy to envision this. Gosh, look, there are things being projected up there from some light source behind you. I want you to imagine that you lived your entire life in this room, and that we had you locked in so you could do nothing but look at those screens. You might think that the world was just what you saw on the screens, and that that was reality. You'd have nothing but those images to go on the basis of. And he's basically saying, imagine a thing like that. Everything you would talk about, you would think you were referring to a real object, but actually you were just referring to the shadow, to the projection, to the representation of it on a screen. And the real thing would be somewhere else. Well, he says that's exactly the situation we're in. Here is one artistic representation of this. The light source in the back, throwing these images on the wall. The prisoners forced to look at that and unable to see anything else. Here you see a media version of Plato's cave that I found on a blog a few weeks ago. Or here's Plato's man cave. Well, anyway. So here is the idea. What's going on? We're supposed to be in the situation of the prisoners. That is, we are really seeing the shadows of these universals. We are seeing particular objects, but they are merely the shadows of these universal things, the forms. And so what we take to be truth is really just something about the shadows, about these representations, these images. The real things are somewhere else. And so what is the job of philosophy? It's to make people realize they're just looking at the shadows. They're just looking at these images of the true realities. And so the goal of philosophy is to set you free, to set loose the chains, let you actually see things as they are. Now, what's going to happen if we go into the cave and release the prisoners? They're going to try to get out of there. They'll look around and they'll realize that everything they've been taking as real is really just a shadow. And they're going to try to get out of there. Well, it's going to be hard. They're going to climb the stairs out of this thing, and they're going to see objects, real objects for the first time. But if the sun will be so bright, they'll find it difficult at first. They'll just look at some shadows. Then they'll look at the objects themselves. Maybe eventually they'll be able to look at the sun, the source of all this light. And so he says there's a kind of progression here from the reflections to the objects themselves, and then to these mathematical forms, finally to the abstract forms themselves. And the ultimate one of those that stands in for the Son, the form of the good. So, that's the meaning of this. He says, look, the prison house I'm describing here is the world of sight. It's the world you and I live in. The light of the fire is the sun. And the journey upwards is the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world. Think about what happens, for example, when you move from just noticing that things when you drop them fall to actually finding out about gravity. It's a revolutionary change in the way you think about things. Before that, yeah, it's just stuff that happens. And then you start understanding why it happens. For the first time, you don't just observe things and generalize about them, you understand why it's happening. And so, Plato says, to understand our world, we need to progress to these abstract forms. We need to actually realize that things in this world are really just instantiating the realities somewhere else. And so that ascent of the soul into the intellectual world is something like that. Something like realizing that the things around us fall into these patterns because they instantiate these more general realities and that they stand in these universal and necessary relations to one another. Well, the one that is at the end of this process, he says, is the form of the good. Because you could say, well, all right, the objects that you see outside the cave, those are like the forms, but now the sun is the one that is making it possible for us to see all those things. And so, what corresponds to the sun? His answer is the form of the good. He says that's the thing that's seen last of all, and only with an effort. And when seen is inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and lord of light in the visible world, the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. This is the power on which he who would act rationally either in public or private life must have his eye fixed. So in the end, it is the form of the good that actually enables us to understand anything. Oh, by the way, the description he gives of the form of the good, what does that sound like? The author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light, lord of light. What does that sound like? Yeah.
I'm not sure if it means God.
Okay, good. Yeah, it sounds like a description of God or venerating some kind of higher power. And indeed, later Platonists generally identify the form of the good with God. Okay? Plato himself never really makes that explicit, although a lot of people think that that's what he had in mind, if you look at this description. But in any case, yes, it's something that later Platonists take, and take for a reason. Because look, what do you mean the form of the good is what enables us to perceive all these other forms? If it's a problem how we can perceive forms, how could we perceive this form and how can it help? But if this form is really God, God can do anything. And so in Augustine, for example, there's this image of God illumining our minds, acting like the sun in shedding light on the realm of forms for our minds. In any event, let me just summarize the view that comes out of all this, because it's something we'll be using again and again. Here's a judgment of perception, an object. Actually, it's nice, a representation of the object in a cave-like situation, a triangle. And you might judge, that's a triangle. Well, the mind is, of course, turned toward that object when you're judging. You're looking at the triangle and observing that. But you must also have the mind, in some sense, turned toward the form of a triangle. Because you're using that term, triangle, in your thought or in your speech, and that's something that is understood only in relation to that universal triangularity. So we perceive the thing as a triangle because we apprehend the form. It's not, as Aristotle and Locke and others think, that we see lots of things that are shaped like that, and we abstract away from things to get the idea, the general idea of a triangle. No, Plato says we'd never be able to use the word triangle. We'd never see what they had in common unless we had some access to the form of triangularity. And so the mind has to be, in a way, turned in two directions at once when we make any such judgment. We're looking at the particular object, the particular triangle, but we are also looking at the universal triangularity, and recognizing that thing as a triangle because we realize that it instantiates the form. And so there is a relationship between my thought and that particular object, but also a relationship between that thought and the form, because in my use of the term triangle, in my thought or in my language, I am actually linking in some way to that abstract form. So he says, look at what students of geometry and arithmetic and so on do. They aren't really concerned with objects. They're concerned with more general things. They have hypotheses, then they prove things on the basis of that. And he says, look, they're reasoning not of the visible forms that they draw, but instead they're thinking of the forms that they resemble. They're really seeking to behold the things themselves, which can only be seen with the eye of the mind. And let me tell you a little story. When I was teaching my daughter geometry, I was going to draw a triangle. There is no chalk. Oh, wait. There was a problem. Show that a certain angle was a right angle. So it was a triangle that looked like this. And certain facts were given about this triangle. Now, how would you go about showing that it's a right triangle? Well, here's what she did. She got out a protractor, put it up here and said, see, 90 degrees. Yep. Now that's not what you do in geometry, right? You don't prove that this is a right triangle by taking out your protractor, measuring it, and seeing that it's 90 degrees. Instead, you have to prove it on the basis of general things you know about that triangle. And his point is, that shows us that when we think about geometry, we're not talking about those particular physical shapes we draw. We're talking about something else, something more abstract. The abstract triangles can only be seen by the eye of the mind. And so we're not interested in the shadows and reflections of those for their own sakes. We often use them in reasoning because it's hard to envision the abstract thing in our minds. But nevertheless, we're just drawing something, and we're not really reasoning about the drawing. We're reasoning about the thing that that drawing represents. But those are things that are more abstract. And those are things that are actually instantiated in the objects. If we've drawn this correctly, the abstract triangle we're talking about will be something that has this sort of shape. And so his official term for that is participation. The object participates in the form. The form is instantiated in the object or exemplified by the object. And so there is a nice explanation here for how our thoughts can be true. Our thoughts stand in a relation to the form that really is instantiated in the object concerned. Well, now there is a puzzle that arises if you think about this, and I want to just conclude with the puzzle because it drives Platonism later. We don't perceive these forms. I mean, maybe I have an eye into my mind, but it seems to be fuzzy and I don't know where it is, and I wish I could get it glasses. And so you might think, yeah, I don't know what this means. This feels like a metaphor. How do we know anything about love or friendship or justice? Or for that matter, about triangularity? How do we know anything about these abstract forms? Aristotle says we abstract that from particular instances. We know the law of gravitation on the basis of instances of things dropping that we've carefully observed. Plato gives a different answer. He says, no, we'd never recognize these things as triangles, as love, and so on, unless we already had access to the form. And he gives two theories of this. One, he says, before we were born, we were in the land of forms, like Homer did. And that they were imprinted on our soul. So in effect, he's saying we have innate knowledge of the forms. And the second answer is that the form of the good acts like the sun and shines light on all of this. If we identify the form of the good with God, then that's an explanation, maybe. But without that identification, it doesn't make much sense. So I'm going to leave you here with a puzzle. If this is supposed to be the picture, then what is that relationship between my thought and the form that he calls recollection or something else? How can that be explained? How can we account for that? And within a generation, the people in charge of Plato's Academy become skeptics because they see no way to actually explain that.